Next up, we'll hear from Hillevi Einsei. Sorry if Einsei. I'm afraid
I've dealt with that all my life. I'm Estonian, it's Hillevi Einsei, but Americans say Hillevi Einsei.
Okay, my apologies.
I go by Dusty.
Dusty, please go ahead.
I'm an independent contractor, and I've been in the green industry, air and water purification for about 15 years. And I'm a graduate of the College of William & Mary, did a lot of research down there, so I was very interested in this case study. I want to thank the Science Advisory Board for providing this forum today to discuss such an important issue. There has been a constant barrage of criticism cast towards hydraulic fracturing over the past few years. However, responsible hydraulic fracturing has been the catalyst of America's energy revolution. With the discovery of huge deposits of natural gas in the Marcellus and Utica shale deposits, the United States has become a global leader in natural gas production. This has resulted in many benefits, including lower energy prices, which helps business people like me in this harsh economy. Thank you, Mr. Obama. It provides more stable sources of energy and high-paying jobs. As you know, the draft report issued last summer concluded that hydraulic fracturing causes no widespread harm to drinking water. While some have said this conclusion is ambiguous or requires more clarification, I hope you will retain this clear policy statement. EPA got it right. Because fracturing has come under attack in recent years, and many of the criticisms are grounded more in emotion than facts, the American people need reassurance that fracking can be done in an environmentally responsible way, which it can be. The evidence that formed the basis of the original conclusion was based on exhaustive analysis of reputable scientific studies and academic papers, which I'm quite familiar with being a graduate of the College of William & Mary. The EPA study found that in the years 2011 to 2014, between 25 and 30,000 new wells were drilled each year, and that 9.4 million Americans live within a mile of a fracking site. The report also states that there are 6,800 drinking water sources within a mile of a well. All this activity supports the conclusion that there is simply no evidence of widespread or systemic contamination of our water systems. There are reasons no such widespread or systemic contamination exists, namely the widespread and systemic application of proven engineering technologies and industry risk management practices. Thank you for your consideration.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, I'd like to hear from Bruce Thompson from the American Exploration and Production Council. Go ahead, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, Mr. Chairman and members of the Science Advisory Board. I am Bruce Thompson, President of American Exploration and Production Council. We're a trade association of 28 independent oil and gas operators, E&P companies. We're the ones that drill the wells, and we don't market or refine, so we're strictly the drillers. Our operations are limited, as I say, to drilling. We are driven by our unique position as large independent operators, as leaders in the development and application of the innovative and advanced technologies necessary to explore for and produce oil and gas. Specifically, AXPC members have substantial expertise in the hydraulic fracturing process, which is the subject of today's hearing, and we're both as pioneers of this important technology and as being primary drivers of the continuing research and development and constant improvement of this incredible high-tech process. Just a second on how we got here today. In 2010, Congress mandated a study of the relationship between hydraulic fracturing and drinking water. After 5+ years of review and a number of sources, a very deliberative process, the hydraulic fracturing panel of this board came away with the conclusion, which has been quoted many times today, that hydraulic fracturing activities have not led to widespread and systemic impacts to drinking water resources. Given this obvious, thorough, and deliberative process and review of all the multiple relevant data sources, one would think that the process would end there. But here we are, a year after the release of that report, now over 6 years, and apparently we're still searching for a conclusion that is condemning of hydraulic fracturing. Nevertheless, AXPC continues to participate in this process in the hope that despite all of the hand-wringing, that science will eventually prevail. We filed 3 extensive comment letters, the first in August of 2015, which was in response to the initial draft report. And we mentioned in that report that hydraulic fracturing, the scope was expanded to include additional steps in the well construction and completion process that have nothing to do with hydraulic fracturing. That's misleading and will inevitably lead to confusion and misinformation about the entire process. Nevertheless, our industry passed this expanded scope with flying colors. AXPC is supportive of a draft report with the expanded scope provided that the expansion is clearly explained and the proper context is provided in the final report so that the public fully understands how safely our operations are actually conducted. Secondly, we noted in that letter that the definition of drinking water was overly broad. It's important, I think, that we have specific criteria to define what we are studying. Again, the result is potential confusion and misleading information in the public domain. The purpose of the study should be to inform, not confuse. Despite these flaws that clearly resulted in an overly broad study and an expansion of the operational universe being studied, the draft study still resulted in the conclusion that I quoted earlier. Our second comment letter was filed in January in response to quotes that this study of the advisory board panel was going to be revisited, the conclusion would be revisited, that it somehow was determined to be ambiguous and requiring clarification. It's difficult for me to understand how it could be, what could be ambiguous about this statement. It's quite clear, it seems to me, and we filed, as I said, we filed a number of, filed this comment letter. It references a number of studies that support the conclusion. These studies have been ongoing for, I think, well over 10 years. It must be added that we have several states regulate this process quite well and extensively, and we are not trying to avoid regulation. We are very well regulated by the states, and they do a good job of this. AXPC's most recent comment letter was June 2nd, 2016, wherein we commented on the news that the panel had voted to clarify the statement. After 5 years of digging and review of peer-reviewed studies, factual evidence, as well as anecdotal offerings, the panel reached the conclusion that apparently disappointed some of those on the hydraulic fracturing side, anti-hydraulic fracturing side of the debate. It would be contrary to the mission of this board for it to yield to political pressure without a basis in science and alter the conclusion of the panel. We strongly urge this board to adopt the dissenting opinion of the panel that the conclusion reached in the initial draft is sound, science-based, and supported by numerous findings of the academic community, government agencies, and professional societies, and does not therefore require modification or additional explanation. Again, my thanks to the board for the time, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Thompson, for your comments. Next, I'd like to invite Greg Kozera to the microphone. He's provided some written
Mr.
documents.
Kozera has provided some handouts. I'll take care of those as we go forward, and they are on the SAD website.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Kozera.
Good morning. I appreciate having the opportunity to visit with this board, and I know the work you're doing is not easy. I am currently the president of Learn Leadership. I've spent 40 years, though, before that in the oil and gas industry, working for several different hydraulic fracturing companies. I'm the past president of Virginia Oil and Gas Association, and I'm still on the board of directors. Our oldest son, Corey, recently retired from the military after 26 years of service. His first 2 tours of duty were in the Middle East. And I can tell you this, that was before we started horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, the whole, we've been fracking for 60 years, but the shale revolution. I can tell you what fear is. My wife's experienced that too. When you wake up in the morning and you hear American helicopter shot down, 14 Americans dead. We're thinking, could it be? Well, folks, today, we don't need their oil. We don't. We have it here if we're smart and if we use sound science and engineering principles to do our work. I didn't find out till Corey's retirement that he almost lost his life in several incidents in those first 2 tours of duty. They don't talk about that much. But tell you what, what hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling has done for this country, we've driven the price of oil down. We've got people that now can have actually money to spend. They can go to Florida and take their families to Disney World. There's 300 million people that are impacted by the decisions industry. Most of them don't even have a clue that it's going on. But think about it, 60 years of study of hydraulic fracturing, 2 million wells, 3 studies, and we're still looking for that one piece of evidence. So I've been doing this for 40 years, working for several frac companies. I've never seen any evidence of fracturing causing any groundwater contamination. One thing that the board that was mentioned in that study, and maybe it'll help you guys, is when the fracturing process is just a few days in the life of a well that's 30, 40, 50 years. So the risks, and they talked about the risks, the greatest risk was from transportation accidents or surface spills. And I can tell you this, in all the years working for frac companies, when there's been any groundwater contamination, it's come from 2 sources. Number 1, septic tanks. Number 2, surface. And there was an auto parts store, for example, that was dumping their antifreeze and waste oil out back into the groundwater, from fracturing. The other thing that may help, there's another point in that study, is that they were worried about shallow wells. And I can understand that when you're talking about fracturing, not Marcellus wells, but these conventional wells, below 2,000 feet, there was a concern. A hydraulic fracture, when it's deep, and there's a picture of that in the handouts, is vertical, it's up and down, like the cracks in the wall. That's due to rock stresses. When we move into shallow wells, those stresses change, and the hydraulic fracture is, we call it pancake. It's like the floor. That's usually above 1,000 feet. The bottom line is, folks, if the industry wanted to frack into someone's water well, we couldn't do it because Mother Nature won't let us. It's just that simple. So, and we know this. In Virginia, we've been fracturing the coal since the 80s. They started that to get the gas out of the mine so that we would have mine explosions, and it's worked out in many fatalities due to methane explosions in Virginia in over 30 years. But the miners, when they're in there, this isn't theory. They see, they know what those fracks are at 1,500, 2,000 feet, they're up and down. When they get below 1,000 feet, they watch that frack turn. So we know that if we want to frack into someone's water well, it doesn't happen. Mother Nature shuts us down. So I guess the other thing just to mention, I live among the wells. We've lived among wells for probably most of my career. I know, being working for several frac companies, we don't use arsenic in our frac fluids. And those wells, we're fine. We're not far from the compressor stations. And I can tell you this, is I know what those wells mean to this country and what they mean to our freedom, and they keep my son and his grandkids from going back to the Middle East. So, folks, I appreciate your time, and please, sound science, good engineering principles, and I'll be happy to answer any questions whenever. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kozera, for your comments. I'd like to move next to hear from Carlson from Range Resources.
Good morning, board members. My name is Carlson. I'm employed by Range Resources, a leading U.S. natural gas producer. Our company is the most active developer of the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. I'm here today to offer comments on the SAB review of EPA's draft assessment. Regardless of its shortcomings, the assessment certainly considered an enormous amount of data from a lot of different sources, many of which have been cited earlier. SAB's draft letter suggests that the 599-page assessment did not include sufficient details of localized minor impacts and investigations that found no impacts. The top two concerns expressed in the draft letter were one, that EPA did not conduct planned prospective studies of hydraulic fracturing, and two, a concern with EPA's top-line findings considering the limited scope of confirmed impacts. On the issue of the prospective studies, we believe that the mere two planned study sites originally selected by EPA would not have provided any representative sampling useful in drawing valid conclusions about impacts from hydraulic fracturing. Because of the rebuttable presumption regulations for water supply contamination that are imposed in many states where drilling occurs, hundreds of thousands of drinking water supplies have been sampled by the industry prior to drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And each of these can be used as a prospective study for analysis of impact. State regulatory agencies have investigated thousands of water supply complaints related to drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which have resulted in very small numbers of minor impacts, none of which were caused directly by the hydraulic fracturing process. Of greater concern is the SAB's objection to EPA's top-line finding that, quote, we did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources, end quote. SAB suggests that the term mechanism and the adjectives widespread and systemic are not well defined. These criticisms seem less about SAB's congressional mandate to provide scientific advice to the agency and more about responding to special interest groups who want to spin statements from the draft report to advance their own agendas. EPA clearly described the mechanisms that were reviewed and the sources of information it reviewed. The systems that EPA evaluated were clearly those that contain drinking water resources, being surface water and groundwater. EPA further qualified its top-line finding with a discussion of the assessment's limitations. The fact is that more than 1 million wells, earlier commenter said 2 million, probably closer, have been hydraulically fractured in the U.S. over the last 60 years. States have effectively regulated the majority of this historic activity. It's well known that activities such as improper construction of oil and gas wells and surface spills of various fluids can and have caused localized impacts to drinking water resources. Because of improved technology and enhanced state regulations, such impacts have become far fewer than several decades ago. The advent of large volume hydraulic fracturing required to produce gas from shale has brought several new challenges over the past decade that were quickly addressed with new technology. We believe that the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water resources are well understood, are neither widespread nor systemic, and that the minor risk of impacts will continue to diminish as state regulations and industry practices continue to evolve. We support the dissenting view attached as Exhibit B to the SAB draft letter, along with the extensive comments previously submitted by IPAA and API on both the EPA study and the SAB's review of the same. We urge the SAB to limit its review of EPA's assessment to technical errors and omissions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your comments, Mr. Carlson. Let's hear from Peter Miller as well, who's also from Rain. Have some opportunity for Q&A from the Science Advisory Board. Go ahead, please, Mr. Miller.
Thank you for getting my name correct. My name is Pete Miller. I'm an employee of Rain Resources as well. I was also an active participant in the EPA studies technical roundtable and workshop committees. Much of the SAB's concerns are focused on a single phrase within the EPA's executive summary. It's a straightforward, high-level conclusion statement from page ES6 that, quote, we did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources in the United States, end quote. The SAB has expressed 4 separate concerns with the wording of this with this simple conclusion statement. The first is that, quote, the statement itself does not clearly describe the systems of interest. While this is true of the statement itself, Page ES3 of the executive summary clearly defines the systems of interest as groundwater or surface water that now serves or in the future could serve as a source of drinking water for the public or private use. And this description by the EPA's own admission is, quote, broader than most federal and state regulatory definitions of drinking water and encompasses both fresh and non-fresh bodies of water, end quote. The second concern that the SAB expressed with the wording of this statement is that the statement itself does not clearly describe the scale of impacts. Again, while this is true for the statement itself, the scale of impacts are discussed in various parts of the executive summary as well as detailed within the study itself, and is also mentioned in the very next sentence following the statement of concern. The third concern is that the statement itself does not clearly describe the definitions of, quote, widespread or, quote, systemic. These words have clear and concise meaning within the context of the assessment and will be readily understood by most reading the assessment. For illustration, an example of, quote, widespread systemic impacts in a similar context can be seen in Pennsylvania's most recent biannual integrated water quality monitoring and assessment report from 2014. This report assesses the water quality of over 83,000 miles of streams and rivers and 80,000 acres of lakes in Pennsylvania. The two top sources of impairment are identified as agricultural activities and abandoned mine drainage. Combined, they impact over 11,000 miles, or 13.6% of all assessed streams and rivers. That scale of impact clearly meets the definition of widespread and systemic. In contrast, impacts from all petroleum activities ranked 27th on the list of impacts and accounted for impacts to 0.076% of all the assessed streams and rivers. The majority of those streams also had multiple impact sources listed. Another example of widespread and systemic impacts can be found in the 2009 Penn State University study. This study found 41% of all water wells sampled across the Commonwealth failed at least one safe drinking water standard. The primary causes of water contamination were found to be poor well construction, on-lot sewage systems, and agricultural practices. Again, this scale of impact clearly meets the definition of widespread and systemic. For most members of the SAB panel also concluded that the term impact, although concisely defined in Appendix J, requires additional clarification and requested that a discussion on what is meant by, quote, any observed change should be given. Again, we believe these words are clear and have clear and concise meanings. As a participant in the original study's technical roundtable and workshop committees, I witnessed firsthand the amount of attention, multi-stakeholder input, and careful evaluation used by the EPA throughout the study process. I believe this same level of attention and evaluation was utilized by the EPA in crafting the high-level conclusion statement as well as the entirety of the draft assessment. Quote, we did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources in the United States, end quote. This provides certainty and clarity. It is not confusing or unclear except to those who are not in agreement with the statement itself. We urge the SAB to limit its review to the EPA's draft assessment to technical errors and omissions rather than advocating for low redefinition of common, well-understood terms, which would actually result in less clarity and more confusion and less certainty. Thank you for your consideration and time.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Okay, so at this time, I'd like to ask if members of the Science Advisory Board present or the two on the phone have any follow-up questions for our public commenters. Okay, 1:10 is up, so go ahead, Michael Dorson.
Well, I appreciate all the public comments. I have a question for Messrs. Thompson, Kozera, Carlson, Miller, or Fannin, Fannin hasn't spoken yet. So the question is, I got from Dr. Brown earlier that we have a fraction of hydrofracking wells or wells that were perhaps not done responsibly, to use Ms. Einsei's comment, or maybe can't be done environmentally responsible, perhaps they were not. Dr. Brown said 0.3%. So 0.3% together with 2 million wells currently available is 6,000 wells that have been impacted. And so my question to you gentlemen is, do you agree with that number or something along that line, please?
You want to address this specifically to anybody?
Any of those insurers would be fine. They all spoke to, I think I got that right, Mr. Garzella. Right, any of those gentlemen would be fine.
Okay. So coming to the microphone is Greg Kozera.
Thank you, Tom. To answer that question, I don't know what that specific number is, 0.3%, but I think what the gentleman from Exxon was trying to convey was even you look in the press, they call that new drilling process called fracking. Two separate processes. We drill a well, we case a well, and then it's fracked. And when you talk about fracturing, hydraulic fracturing itself, that number probably is closer to zero. Because, like I said, you've got most of the groundwater issues that I've ever heard about have always come during the drilling process because you're actually drilling through that groundwater. And at that point, if there's a vulnerability, that's what it's going to be. Now, what most people do is they're drilling with fresh water, we drill with air, but once that well's cased, and you see from my diagram those casing, once that well's cased, I can't imagine. I mean, we're not going to frack up into it because Mother Nature won't let that happen. So you're already fracturing at deep depth. So I would, do I have a number on it? No, because my guess is it's probably closer to zero. If there's going to be a groundwater issue, it will be during the drilling process.
Thank you.
Jim McCaslin.
Yeah, I had a question for Mr. Miller.
Peter Miller is coming to the phone. Sorry, to the mic.
I appreciate your comments.
Your mic's not on.
Okay. I appreciate your comments, Mr. Miller, and I especially appreciate that you referred back to the original EPA document. So I just had one question, because part of the discussion this morning has been on this high-level comment about widespread and also in the ES. So EPA stated in the executive summary on page 23 and 24 that the number of identified cases where drinking water resources were impacted are small relative to the number of hydraulically fractured wells. But then they went on to say that this could be because there's not an impact, or there might be insufficient pre and post hydraulic fracturing data on the quality of drinking water resources that inhibits a determination of the frequency of impact. So as someone who seems like they've paid special attention to the original report, and yes, do you find that comment about saying there's no widespread impact, but then acknowledging that it might be because of lack of data contradictory?
I believe somewhat. I think the attention on that single statement, kind of discounts the rest of the summary itself. But with regards, they did go on to say, I believe, that's the very following sentence you mentioned, there were localized impacts. I know in Pennsylvania we have an extremely broad database of pre-drill so that's out there. I'm not sure if it's feasible for the study to look at every single point of the across all of them, but the representative sample, I believe they looked at representative samples. So, in my opinion.
Okay, Bill? Field?
Yes, I had a question, Mr. Thompson.
Question for Mr. Thompson.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I appreciate your testimony. What I'm hearing a bit about this morning is that there seems to be hydraulic fracturing is fine. There's not a problem with that, but there's a problem with the well drilling. And I was wondering if you could tell me from your experience, in some cases, a small percent of cases, so I was wondering if you could tell me from your experience, what happens when you're doing a well, you see a problem?
Well, it depends on the nature of the problem, and I,
That affects groundwater.
right, and I'm not an engineer, I'm a lawyer.
Okay.
So, quick disclaimer there. But there's a number of best practices that are enforced when folks, any companies drilling a well. If there were a problem with groundwater, I would just assume what would happen, they would shut it down right then and stop the process and fix whatever the problem was. But what Gene said earlier is exactly right. Once you go through the groundwater table, it's cased and then it's protected. And so I think, and I really don't, I mean, we've said that a lot of these problems sometimes are just surface spills. Also, things get spilled on the surface. We talked about antifreeze and septic tanks and that sort of thing. So it's really not, it's part of the process of drilling the well writ large, but not specifically drilling.
Okay. Then sort of a follow-up question. When you drill a well, you know that the intent is for hydraulic fracturing, is that right? Or
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you know that you probably, well, particularly in the unconventional reservoirs, yes.
Okay. So when well, let me ask this, what percent of wells that you drill for hydraulic fracturing are not fracked? Do you know that?
I don't know the answer to that. I would guess it's pretty small.
Okay. But it does happen.
I would have to have someone that knows that better than I do not know. I can't imagine. If they drill the amount of money spent to drill these wells, and they will go through the process of fracturing it if they find the reservoir that they think is there.
Right. I was just wondering in the case that maybe it was found to affect water quality, so now it would be fracked.
Oh, no, exactly, that's right. If you were somehow impacting the water, you would stop the process, correct?
Okay, thanks.
Right.
Dr. Solomon.
Actually, before you leave. So my first question is about the sort of the breadth of companies. A number of folks from API and from different companies have talked about best practices. A number of API standards or guidelines have been referenced. And my question has to do with how many companies there are out there that do hydraulic fracturing, and sort of what the mechanisms are in place to ensure that these guidelines are used universally.
First, for example, my members are the folks that are drilling the wells. We contract with someone to do the hydraulic fracturing work. We don't do it ourselves. I don't know how many folks, the service companies do that work. Halliburton is a good example, Baker Hughes, Schlumberger, and there are a number of other smaller companies throughout the U.S. that do the actual hydraulic fracturing part of the process. So I don't know what that number would be. In terms of standards, we have at HBC, we have a very, very robust environmental health and safety committee that spends an enormous amount of time constantly reevaluating the best practices and how we can improve and do what we do better. And it is a constant process in this industry. I can tell you that a lot of horsepower and engineering and a lot of experts are spend time on this, and we work very hard at it. And API has very high standards, and they're enforced by company enforcement procedures and state enforcement procedures as well.
So you feel that every company that's doing this has equivalent
I'm not sure I can say that. I don't know the answer to that. But no, they all have an enormous amount of expertise, for sure. All the service companies do. They're all good at what they do. It is an incredibly high-tech business, what these folks do, and it requires a lot of expertise. You don't just show up and do this.
My other question has to do with well integrity. So I understand that you wouldn't fracture a well if there's a problem with the casing. But I also understand that there are old wells that may be in place in formations, abandoned wells, even wells that are unknown to be there. How do you deal with those when you're out there trying to decide if it's safe? Because those could be, I would assume, an outlet back up into an aquifer.
If I may interject, perhaps Greg Kozera would like to join the conversation.
Yeah, please.
As an engineer. Nothing against lawyers.
No, I'm getting a little far afield here, so.
So you can share the mic.
Well, I guess it's so, and that's why we're all here, this whole hydraulic fracturing question, why it's so important to us, people in this room, but also our entire nation, is that it seems to get missed, and we probably haven't done a good job communicating this industry, is virtually every well in the United States requires hydraulic fractures. But there's some offshore wells, and every once in a while, someone will drill into something that's really good. But generally speaking, we're talking 95% of the well. Marcellus well, there's no such thing as a natural Marcellus well. You got to frack it. So the bottom line is, companies don't drill unless they can frack. If fracking, for instance, in New York State, you don't see any fracking. You don't see any drilling. So if you can't frack, you don't drill. It's just that simple. But here's the rest of the story. Russia fracks, OPEC fracks, China fracks.
I'm
It's
sorry
part
to
of the
interrupt,
process.
but my question was a different one.
Oh, I just want to clarify that, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
Just to repeat my question, it was about old abandoned wells and what the procedure is to ensure that perhaps defective casings in those wells wouldn't form a conduit back up, because this issue of defective well casings has been raised, and the issue of not fracking a well with a defective casing has been raised, but that other issue has not.
That's a great question. And there are areas of the country where that's certainly possible. And if you know there's a well there beforehand, you plug it. But if, like you said, if it's unknown, what will happen from an engineering standpoint immediately, that you'll see a pressure loss dump. In other words, the pressure is X, and if you frack into that abandoned well, the pressure's going to drop. And as soon as that happens, normally what happens is you shut down, because you know something's not right. Either there's been a failure somewhere. So the standard practice is when you lose pressure dramatically, you shut down, try to figure out what happened. If it's really dramatic, if that would happen to communicate even to the surface, again, you'd know that, but if you think about it, water, fluids take that path of least resistance. If that least resistance is through an old well bore, it's easier to go, in other words, once you quit fracking and relieve the pressure on the well you're fracturing, what's going to happen to that fluid even in that abandoned well? It's not going to go out into the water. It goes back down to where it came from, because that's the easiest place to go. It's always easier to follow that crack or that wellbore path than it is to get into a reservoir. And the other thing that may help us all from even a water standpoint is water isn't in a cave, it's in pores. So again, to get into those pores requires a certain amount of pressure. So again, if you hit that abandoned wellbore, as soon as you shut down, what's going to happen to that fluid? When you relieve the pressure on the well that's being fracked, it's going to go back down to that original formation. And at that time, now you know where that well is. Everything goes, shuts down, and when you didn't plug that original well, it's now located. So it's a rare event, but when it happens, again, I don't even see that as being related to groundwater contamination, because the path of least resistance isn't into the groundwater, it's going to be back down that well. Does that make sense?
I guess so. How do you know then where that well is once you have a loss of pressure?
Well, if it comes, there's been cases where it comes right to the surface, and you know where it is.
That's interesting. Good to know.
Because again, if it's a well that's an old well,
Does
we're
that
talking.
happen frequently?
Can I chime in here?
Bruce, sure. We're talking about stuff that's been drilled back in the 1800s, and even when you're doing a Marcellus, the deep fracks we're doing today, you're not going to see that, because those wells are shallow and we're down thousands of feet. So the odds of that happening today are pretty slim.
Okay, so Jim Zernell has come here.
Thank you. So where we work in Oklahoma, it's been drilled for many years at very close densities in very shallow areas. We study all these, every time we go drill a well, we study all the offset wells, looking for the wells that you're concerned about, Doctor, wells that might be abandoned or whatever. And we identify them. If we have to offset them, we'll take note of that. The wells that are already there have already met the state requirements, which all the wells have protective casing across the drinking water zones. So the well you're fracking is protected from the drinking water. All the wells that, if they're abandoned within to the law, all would be abandoned to withhold pressure from below. But the original design and wellbore construction would have protected the water from the beginning as well. So you have a lot of protection there from both the well you're fracture treating and also the well that might be abandoned. The other thing to keep in mind is that we actually, as we go through and look at all the wells, it's important to know where they're at, because it's also an understanding of what's been produced from the area, what's the geology there. So we spend a lot of time studying all the other wells that are in the drilling unit or intersection. It's not like we're just out there not paying attention to those wells. It's very important.
So let me just, were you going to follow up? Okay, so let me just take a question here. We have Sue, Marty, Denise Mazzarell, Steve Hamburg, and Rob Mace, who have their cards up, which are specific to this issue. Okay. So Steve, why don't you go ahead? Oh, and sorry, Sue, then you go ahead.
So I was just curious, Mr. Thompson said that if you drill down, this is not necessarily fracking, this is the drilling process in advance, and you hit a drinking water resource and it's impacted, that you'd stop that process right away. And I'm just curious, with best practices, how soon would you know that has happened, and how would you figure that out?
I can't attest that. I don't know of a single case of drinking water being impacted by the operation of drilling the shallow portion of the well. The well's being drilled with fresh water and gels. So I don't know of any case where there's been any from the actual drilling of the surface hole. So that's what we call the area where the fresh water is. It's all being done in very benign conditions. So I can't say where I even know heard of it.
The other thing that helps, people know we know where the fresh water is. Plenty of, like you said, plenty of geology. We know what's in an area. They do a lot of work before any of this happens. So if you're drilling, for instance, we drill on air. So air, if there's any pressure from the groundwater, it's going to want to come in. So again, the air, you're under balance, so the odds of anything going out into that fresh water is pretty small. Almost impossible.
Steve Hamburg.
So just to follow up for a second on this abandoned well issue that was raised, I'm a little, I guess I'm puzzled by some of the answers, because as I understand it, the majority of the wells, particularly in the older areas like the eastern United States, Pennsylvania, Ohio, have not been mapped. They do not have casings above ground. They're not easy to find. And they could have, it's not as simple as plugged or unplugged. They could have intermediate cases, so that there could be some conductivity, but it wouldn't be dramatic. Is that not true? And if the maps exist, or those data exist, where do they exist?
The state...
Mr. Chairman, may I answer this question? I have a lot of experience in the Appalachian area.
Please go to the microphone. Can you please identify yourself for the folks on the phone?
My name is Carlson with Range Resources. I've worked 40 years in the Appalachian Basin, mostly in Pennsylvania. And you are absolutely correct that there are significant numbers of undocumented wells, estimated about 500,000 wells drilled in Pennsylvania. Well, permitting didn't start until the 1950s, so anything prior to that, back to 1859, when Colonel Drake discovered oil, are less documented. There are a lot of reports and studies from those early days, but they're not as complete as the permit process since the 1950s. We do know, however, with respect to shale development, that the early drilling was almost exclusively very shallow, generally less than about 2,500 feet. So we're fracking the Marcellus Shale at 6,000 to 8,000 feet. There's really no opportunity for fractures to grow up into the depths of those early wells. There's minor exceptions to that. There are some early deep wells drilled that are fairly well documented because the economic interest in those deeper wells at the time caused a lot of state agencies to report on those, as well as industry. There's been 2 cases that I'm aware of in Pennsylvania where fracturing of shale wells has impacted a unplugged abandoned well. They were both deep wells drilled in the 1930s. They were both actually known and in the state records before the fracturing occurred. And to my knowledge, neither of them resulted in any groundwater impacts. So, does that answer your question?
Okay, Denise.
Yes, I have a question for Melissa Troutman.
Ms. Troutman?
Sorry, here I am.
Bill, can you turn off that second? Thank you.
Go pick my meter.
And Denise.
I was interested in your public maps of well contamination at publicfiles.org. I just checked to find them and I couldn't, so I was hoping you might be able to provide them.
Sure. If you go to publicfiles.org, in the left-hand column, if you click on complaints, when you hover over, it'll complaints are. Sorry, I was just running up the stairs. Complaints are organized by DEP regional office. So they're organized by the Eastern Regional Office, the Southwest Regional Office, and the Northwest Regional Office. And once you click on one of those regional offices, you'll see a list of counties. And when you click on a county, the county map will come up. And you'll see that the townships are color-coded according to how many complaints the department has received from that township. The darker the red, the more the complaints. And then underneath each county's map are all of the complaint files that we've gathered for that county.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to chime in here.
Are you responding to a particular question?
Loss of circulation and abandoned wells.
Okay, please sit at the mic and we'll hear from you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Robert McCaslin.
Yes, thank you.
Most of the time when we're drilling through that aquifer, we're actually out racing it. And what I mean by that is if we pack it off and then with Baylor seal or whatever we're drilling with, cedar fiber, packing that freshwater aquifer off. And when we lose circulation downhole, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to learn, we're going to live, and we're going to forget these abandoned wells. What I mean by that is where these abandoned wells and the loss of circulation, we're going to do it again because the fresh water that we use to maintain the hydro-fracking partial of the operation, but during the drilling process, we're going to regain our 1,400 barrel system, and we're going to pump down hole. We're going to continue to pump down hole, and that creates other issues later. But that's what I had to share about, when you lost circulation down hole, or you take on too much water. There are always signs. So we're always watching that stuff. We're gauging it.
Dr. Solomon, is that clear? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your comment, Mr. McCaslin. And Denise, your tag's still up, but okay, Robert, please go ahead.
I had a question for Bruce Thompson. And also just want to say thanks to Robert McCaslin, because I was going to call him up to ask a similar question that he answered.
Can you put your mic a little closer so we can hear you better?
I'm going to look this way, so I'm not ignoring you. My question is on this loss of circulation when drilling wells through aquifers, how often is that an issue? It seems like the water samples I see seem to be lost circulation fluids.
Yep. I really have to defer to some engineers on this. This is not my area of expertise, but I don't think it's very frequent at all, but I'm happy to let perhaps the range guys or Jim can answer that question better than I can.
I suggest Carl.
Carl, okay, good. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
I don't mind.
Just sort of well drilled.
I want to make sure you get the right information.
No, I appreciate
Okay,
that.
so Carlson's coming to the microphone.
Yes, I agree that the setting of the water protection screen or casing is a very, very important part of the well life, and issues can arise if that's done improperly. It has to be set at the right depth, and the drilling down to that point has to be done properly. As Mr. Kozera mentioned earlier, in the Appalachian Basin, most of the drilling of that shallow part of the hole is done by pumping air down the drill string to circulate the cuttings of the outside. So the pressure in the wellbore is far lower than the pressure in the aquifers. So any flow is going to be into the wellbore from the aquifer and little opportunity for the reverse. Once that casing is set and through the deepest known freshwater aquifer, it's cemented to surface, meaning we pump cement down the inside of the pipe, force it out of the pipe, and circulate it up in a sheath outside the pipe all the way back to the surface. So once that job is done correctly, and we know when we get circulation of cement back to the surface that that aquifer is protected, and all the rest of the activity on the well, multiple additional casings, and the fracturing itself, the freshwater aquifer is protected. Does that answer?
Is it in part, is that typical for all the areas across the country where hydraulic fracturing is occurring, or is this just typical in the Appalachian area?
In some areas, drilling mud, a freshwater-based mud is used to drill that surface hole. It is has far less additives in it than the type of mud you might use for drilling deeper formations. But it has viscosity improvers in it and fluid loss materials that prevent influx of that fluid into the aquifer. So there's no hydraulic fracturing going on. Fluid loss is well understood in those aquifer formations. So the drillers are set with the right tools and right additives in their fluid system to prevent the fluid loss from occurring in the shallow.
Okay, thank you. I had a quick question for Mr. Gale, if I might. That's simply, how do you define regional basis in the comments that you made? Just what are you talking about when you say regional basis?
I just think it's important to look at the data sets as they're defined in those studies. There was a statement made over here trying to extrapolate 0.3% to all of the wells ever drilled and making a rough estimation. The study that was referenced is a smaller subset. And so ensuring that we're looking at the appropriate boundaries of those studies and not extrapolating beyond necessary means, which would dilute the overall view of the data that's being looked at.
So when you make comments on regional basis, are you talking about a geological region like Marsalis, or are you talking about state, or are you talking about a county? Is there some way to put a domain to that?
I'm referring just specifically to those boundary conditions stated by the individual studies that are put out.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Could I add one clarifying statement to the drilling process?
Sure.
We talk about drilling through freshwater reserves. When we put in a water well out in the areas that we're talking about, the drilling process occurs to put a water well in the ground, and we don't get concerned about contamination. That's because the technology exists to be able to drill a water well without those concerns. Those same technologies are deployed. So I think it's important to keep in mind.
Okay, thank you. David Richardson.
Thank you. I suppose the question is directed maybe to Ray Campbell, or it could be to others, but it in part relates to this number of 0.3% that was quoted and I take that again as perhaps an illustrative value quoted for a region and maybe for a particular time period. But I'm trying to reconcile it in my head with other numbers that are in the EPA report, and then even larger numbers that were quoted for one county in Pennsylvania. So the EPA report has something about, and I apologize, an evaluation of well integrity in Pennsylvania, which was described as well integrity, significant increase in well integrity problems from 2009 to 2011, rising from 5 to 6%, which sounds to me as different from 0.3%. And I take your point that those values are averaged over different periods and regions. And Ray, I believe you were talking about wells near you in which you were quoting something like 18, or I don't remember, but again, we're another order of magnitude larger again.
Well, that's what we got from Tony Agralia and Duke University and Yale on the study when they were doing it. Problem is, everybody wants to say, fracking causes groundwater contamination. Fracking does not cause groundwater contamination. Casing failure causes the groundwater contamination. The fracking fluid will come back up out of these wells for at least 50 years. It comes back up. When you have casing failure, and the fluids are coming back up and leaking out of the casing failure, it leaks back down into the aquifers, and this is what causes groundwater contamination. But they're the ones that were coming up with the numbers, and it progresses. And as what we're noticing now, where DEP has been back in the Dimmick and in the Susquehanna County, they've come up with these numbers because so many of the fatal casings right now is, every time I turn around, they come up with another casing failure.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I think that's useful because the other thing I was trying to map onto were the concerns that you were raising relative to the structure of the report that we have, which lays out a series of issues: water acquisition, chemical mixing, well injection, flow back, and then wastewater management and disposal.
Right.
And the particular issue you're concerned with, I think, falls within the chapter or section about well injection. This is where they talk about well integrity and casing failures.
Right.
And so the probabilities of failure that you're concerned with relate within your region to your experience with the how often casing failures may occur, and that it's different than the 0.3% that we were talking about more generally.
That's right.
Okay.
And again, being an ex-Gale, I've already been, on the frac sites where we brought up well online, and we stood right at the wellhead and watched it bubbling. They knew the casing has failed, but we still put that well online, and we'll worry about when we get caught. I mean, Ranger Resource was fined $8.9 million in Pennsylvania, and it was rescinded because now we have an administration of DEP, and the governor rescinded it, so they got another slap on the wrist, and they rescinded an $8.9 million fine. So this is where we need help.
So take one more. Could I ask just one more thing, just for helping me clarify what the concerns are?
And then we'll hear from Steve Hamburg, and then we have to take a break.
And this is Melissa Troutman again. Maybe, and this is I didn't want to ask a specific individual, so I'm asking you to put your hat on as a journalist. Because it's about the concerns within the region, about the issues of fracking. Is it this issue of casing failure, or are the other major categories here of water acquisition in Pennsylvania, chemical mixing in Pennsylvania, wastewater disposal? Are those the major issues, or should we be focusing on well injection and the integrity of wells? What are the concerns?
Are you asking what, we've interviewed many people across the state. Are you asking what their main concern is?
Yeah, when this is framed, is it framed in terms of the categories the EPA has framed it, or is it framed in terms of certain mechanisms by which people believe that there's an issue leading to?
When somebody's water goes bad after industrial activity moves in next door, it doesn't matter whether it was during the drilling or during the perforating or during the flow back process. They notice a change in their water quality. Their pre-drill tests and their post-drill tests show that there's impact. Designating what particular moment doesn't really matter that much to the water well owner. The biggest concern that we've found for people is that when their water is contaminated, the state offers no help. Even when the state does try to help, their hands are pretty much tied. I mean, when the DEP says, hey, company X, you've contaminated the water, and the company says, no, we didn't, in order for DEP to rectify that situation, they have to litigate against the company. And
am I correct, you quoted a number of 278 confirmed cases. This is where the state established that there was a difference in water quality pre versus post, and confirmed that that was due to drilling?
Right now, DEP has on their website, if you Google PA DEP determination letters, you'll get their PDF of confirmed water contamination cases related to unconventional oil and gas drilling. And right now their number is 278 as of this morning.
Okay, thank you.
Steve Ham.
So just a clarifying question, I don't know if it's for Ray or for folks in the industry or both. You referenced hydraulic fluids coming back over time, but there really are two phenomena there, and I just have this action for clarification. So over time, you're more going to get the formation water as opposed to what went down well, and the chemistry will change over time. And I just want to make sure that's what we're talking about here, because it's not a concept.
Well, when the drilling was done in the Dimmick, okay, and DEP put that 9-mile moratorium in, it was showing all the fracking chemicals and fluids coming back up. So again, when you have casing failure and you're bringing it back up, it doesn't matter if it's now at the process of putting the well online or casing failure 3 years down the road, you still have it coming back up out of the well, and you have it coming back up, leaking out, going into the aquifer.
Well, I don't know if anyone from the industry wants it, but I mean, the chemistry, at least the data that I've seen, changes over time.
Yeah.
As a function of the
I'm gonna
formation water.
let Lee, the driller, I'm gonna let him go into that for you.
Is this shut off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
But anyways, I was just listening to some air drilling. And air drilling is, we deal with foam, and it's highly intoxicated type atmosphere. When you're making a connection, you'll bleed off with high pressure. But when you get to the point where your casing's set, both in Pennsylvania and North Dakota, then this is a very important process, because your aquifer is just above inside your casing, right here. Maybe 20 to 50 feet away from it now. But we've already shattered the drilling process when we're drilling down. And then looking the next phase of the drilling, we transferring over to inverted mud, which haven't been used since the 70s. And that's a process there is you know, it's already made up mud, and the Halliburton, maybe you could answer what's that? It's inverted mud, you know, because it's liquefied and then you have to soak it down. And if you work in it, it sucks the life out of you. But with that transfer over that period of time, it's close to the groundwater. You know, we did away with it in the 70s. You know, research will show that. So if that answers your question a little bit about rising to the surface.
Well, actually not, but that's okay, we don't need to keep going. I mean, I was talking about the water that comes back it changes over time. There's a temporal dynamic and the chemistry of it changes over time. I'm just trying to just clarify that point. It's not the same chemistry, at least from the data that I see.
May I address that question?
Yeah, go ahead. And we
Carl,
do have to break, so after this.
Carl Carlson again from Range Resources. We don't believe in the Marcellus, and I think it applies to most of the other gas shales in the country, that there is any mobile water. We don't think that there's formation water in the shale that actually moves. So the water that comes back is entirely frac water that we've injected. You're correct, the chemistry changes over time, generally over the first few weeks, but the longer that the water is in contact with the rock, the more dissolved material from the bound water in the shale is absorbed into the frac water through molecular diffusion. So when it flows back, it gets saltier and saltier because it's had more contact time with the shale and absorbed more minerals. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. I think with that, it's time for us to take a Bill?
For Mr. Carlson.
Okay. I'll indulge Bill.
Thank you. And maybe it's a.
You have to turn off one or the other.
Yeah, turn off the tables. There you go. There we go. So maybe this is a question you can't answer, so I apologize if it is. So you've heard statements this morning talking about these 270 confirmed cases in Pennsylvania. You're familiar with that area. What's your take on the cause of those cases, or any of you want to offer? I really appreciate your answer.
I think there's a lot of confusion about what contamination actually is. It is not uncommon for small amounts of gas to bubble up outside, particularly the production casing, the innermost casing string. That's because there is open rock exposed outside that casing at deeper depths that can work up through the fluid in the well and get to the surface. That is not an indication of groundwater contamination at all. There's 2 or sometimes 3 additional casings outside that string that are cemented all the way to the surface. So just an indication of bubbling is not the same as groundwater impact. The fact that there is so much naturally occurring methane in groundwater, in the shallow groundwater in Pennsylvania, does make it very difficult for the department to unravel some of these complaints. So, there are some statistics out there that DEP in Pennsylvania went through a period where they were, writing NOVs for every bubble, but that, as people understood more the widespread natural occurrence of methane in groundwater, I think we're all learning together.
So we're going to go to break now.
Okay.
We have to break. We're past our time, and Tom has some housekeeping issues.
We went along a little bit, some great questions, answers, so thank you all for participating in that.
Oh, okay, that's a typo in my notes. That makes more sense, Mr. Smith. Okay, please go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you. I appreciate your accommodation today. I had knee surgery 2 weeks ago and having trouble getting up and down out of the chairs. Also, if you happen to notice a little tremor as I'm speaking, I was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's. So I'm your guy if you like your martinis shaken down. We appreciate this opportunity to share our thoughts regarding the draft SAB report prepared by the Research Advisory Panel. At the outset, we wish to express our support for the draft prepared by the panel. As citizen NGOs, that we want to applaud the open and transparent process followed by the panel and by the advisory board's staff. There are 5 points I'd like to make today. First, I want to underscore the importance of the discussion in the draft report about the 3 poster children sites of fracturing damage to the public environment. We all know these as Dimmick, Pavilion, and Parker County, Texas. The panel correctly calls on EPA to incorporate these cases in a more meaningful way in its further investigation and assessment. But we urge you to recognize that these sites are only the tip of the iceberg among heavily and irreversibly impacted localities. Sites in Hickory Township, Pennsylvania, Clearville Township, Pennsylvania, Garfield County, Colorado, Porter Ranch, California, Bainbridge, Ohio, and many, many more demand equal attention and action. A review of the compendium of scientific, medical, and media findings demonstrate risks and harms of fracking and of the list of harm will provide thousands of sites across the United States to cry out for EPA attention. Second point is about data regarding contamination of water supplies. All too often we are finding that regulatory agencies will not accept data of contamination obtained by property owners or individuals who have been exposed to contamination from one or more activities in the hydraulic fracturing water cycle. Often the regulators question whether appropriate sampling, custody, and analysis protocols have been observed. Here at the same time, these agencies will accept without question data provided by industry at these same sites. There is documentation of adherence to protocols applying to sampling, custody, and analysis. There can be no justification for not considering the data obtained by the property owner or impacted individual. After all, these are situations in which data from the regulatory agency's own testing may be questionable. Data is data, and all of it should be considered equal weight if proper protocols are followed. Third point is best management practices. The draft report credits and encourages EPA to support the application of the gas industry of best management practices to actions within hydraulic water fracturing water sites. However, the discussion of BMPs in the draft report overlooks several factors that should be kept in mind as balancing considerations. BMPs are entirely voluntary. There is no enforceability of BMPs, nor is there any new metric to define what is and what isn't a BMP. These considerations should be added to the draft report. To my fourth point, there should be a recognition in the draft and EPA's assessment that frac gas development is an inherently contaminating industrial process. The scientific literature reports that between 4 and 12% of all hydraulically fractured wells will leak immediately upon completion. Further, the contamination caused by these activities is permanent. Underground source of drinking water that becomes contaminated from fracking activities is forever contaminated. In a very real sense, frac gas development areas become sacrifice zones. My final point is we agree with the advisory panel that the EPA conclusion in this draft report about widespread systemic impacts cannot stand. Quite to the contrary, we believe that widespread systemic impacts on drinking water sources have been demonstrated by the overwhelming body of scientific information reported in the peer-reviewed literature on this subject. That concludes my prepared remarks. I wanted to address some of the questions if I have a moment to do so.
Please turn your mic on. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for having me here today. Members of the Science Advisory Board and guests, welcome. I am Captain Retired James McCormick. I'm a retired U.S. Army veteran who served in 2 wars in the Middle East, wounded 3 times. I'm also the father of 8 children, of which 2 are currently serving our country, respectfully, in the Air Force and the Army. 1 already has been deployed to the Middle East. In addition, I'm an advocate for veterans, Gold Star families, and the proper care and employment of those veterans who return from service. I'm also an organic farmer and promote a program called Veterans and Warriors to Agriculture that assists veterans with starting farms and agribusiness opportunities. Our most successful program is in beekeeping and organic and natural farming practices. I'm here today to share my personal experiences with natural gas operations, to include hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, as some may call it. As you know, the honeybee is one of the most sensitive creatures known to man. In addition, clean water resources, clean air, and stable soils are critical to success in agriculture operations. In the last 7 years since retiring from the Army, I have farmed, and others have farmed and kept bees within a mile of well sites, pump stations, and yes, fracking pads. Over 9.4 million people live within a mile of fracking sites in America. I can say in the last 7 years that not one of our friends or myself have had a single issue with water contamination, soil contamination, air quality issues, or suffered a catastrophic loss to our bees or crops as a result of. In other words, we have not experienced any issues or air quality problems caused by hydraulic fracturing over the last 7 years, which is the same period of time West Virginia has conducted significant horizontal drilling and fracking. In fact, we've experienced the opposite. We went from 40 veteran farmers to 270. 100 have started small businesses. 1 is operating within 2 miles of a fracking pad and will probably make $1 million. They're doing very well. Therefore, I stand in support of the scientific and in-depth study by the EPA. And coming from West Virginia and saying that I support the EPA is pretty tough. 4,500 miners will stand up and tell you that are unemployed that the EPA is not going to just look the other way. So whenever I hear things like the EPA is not doing their job, they're covering things up, I don't think that I can see that. I can take you to McDowell County, West Virginia, and other places that have become virtual ghost towns. But for me to stand here and to tell you that the EPA got it right this time, I can honestly say that and look each of you in the eyes and tell you that. Therefore, I stand in support. I also would like to add that the local gas and oil industry in West Virginia has been overwhelmingly supportive of our program in agriculture, to include land access, which if they thought there was going to be an issue, they wouldn't let us put beehives up next to those pads. We haven't had an issue. Finally, I'd like to close as a veteran and father of 2 sons, one who's been deployed once, getting ready to be deployed again. I want to reiterate the importance that fracking has had on our national security. Let me explain something to you. That terrorism is funded by resources outside of this country. And that's just a fact that nobody can ignore. Terrorists are given money to operate, and they get a lot of that money from foreign oil sales. So I stand here as a father and a friend to 19 individual people who gave their life in this war, personal friends of mine. And I ask you to support the EPA's decision and to support making America energy independent. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCormick, for your words.
My name is Ron Wilcox. I'm a citizen of Fairfax County, Virginia. I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm very pleased to be here today. I am not representing any particular organization, but I'm representing my own views. Thank you for your opportunity. Thank you for affording me the opportunity to offer my comments today. The issue of American energy independence is important for our economy, and it is crucial that we prioritize the sustainability of our oil and gas production based on the sound science behind the safety record of hydraulic fracturing. That record spans more than 70 years, and in 2016, hopefully 7 decades of data have brought us to this point where the EPA can attest to the widespread safety of this practice. That long record of observational data is reflected in the findings of the EPA. The conclusion of the EPA's draft assessment last June was an important step for American energy production, ensuring that we are able to maximize our energy potential by allowing the energy industry to safely operate free from the encumbrances of unnecessary overregulation is a clear mark of progress. That conclusion is one that it was not reached lightly, but rather represented the investment of over 5 years of rigorous analysis and reviews of more than 900 scientific studies. Those studies have confirmed that hydraulic fracturing can be done in an environmentally responsible way. As time goes on, other regulatory agencies are reaching similar conclusions. Just last month, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement found no significant environmental effects of hydraulic fracturing off the California shores. The joint study by these two federal agencies was based on 30 years of analysis and 23 different offshore hydraulic fracturing operations. The exhaustive study concluded that there would be no significant impact on the water quality or the health of the ocean, and further indicates that fracking presents only a minimal risk when performed according to industry standards. Indeed, the clean burning natural gas produced through hydraulic fracturing will play an indispensable role in meeting the energy and environmental needs of the United States in the 21st century. As the demand for energy continues to grow, the abundance of natural gas has helped keep America's fuel blend affordable and clean. Hydraulic fracturing has lowered electricity bills for families and provided an affordable energy foundation for the creation and maintenance of American jobs in an increasingly global economy. By bringing online previously unexploited reserves, hydraulic fracturing has also lessened America's dependence on foreign energy sources, much to the benefit of our economy, our national security, and the world's environment. By ensuring this clean and responsible means of energy production, we avoid offshoring jobs or pushing energy production overseas where environmental safeguards may be lax compared to the United States. With all this in mind, I hope you will reaffirm the conclusion that fracking poses no systemic risk to groundwater. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wilcox. Next up, we have Roland Reisinger. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the board, I'd like to thank you for affording this opportunity to weigh in on science so deeply connected with the public interest and the future of America's energy economy. Now, in this hearing, we've heard of the superb safety record of hydraulic fracturing with respect to our drinking water resources. Now, this conclusion is not one which was reached lightly. Indeed, by the EPA's own work, Over 900 separate studies were examined over a period of 5 years in order to draw that conclusion. Hydraulic fracturing is not a new technology by any means. In fact, our nation's energy producers have more than 70 years of experience with hydraulic fracturing, and consequently our scientists have had more than 70 years to study its effects. According to the Department of Energy, quote, more than 4 million oil and gas related wells have been drilled in the United States since development of these energy resources began nearly 150 years ago. At least 2 million of these have been hydraulically fracture treated, and up to 95% of new wells drilled today are hydraulically fractured, accounting for more than 43% of total U.S. oil production, 67% of natural gas production, end quote. That is, ladies and gentlemen, what you might call widespread and systemic. We have a widespread and systemic record of experience with hydraulic fracturing, and yet, as the study has affirmed, there are no widespread and systemic threats to drinking water resources. Now, according to the draft assessment, and I quote, between 2000 and 2013, approximately 9.4 million people lived within 1 mile of a hydraulically fractured well. Approximately 6,800 sources of drinking water for public water systems were located within 1 mile of at least one hydraulically fractured well during the same period. These drinking water sources served more than 8.6 million people year-round in 2013. So make no mistake, the draft assessment's conclusions are based upon no shortage of data points. Now, such a wealth of data covering decades of active extraction from countless wells in proximity to monitored water supplies provides a more than adequate sample size for drawing these evidence-based conclusions reached by over 900 studies now incorporated into the draft assessment. So let's be clear, if there were a widespread and systemic problem, we'd know it. Rather, we sit here today examining what is controversial to some because anecdotal remarks, alarmism, and agenda-driven junk science have created an irrational opposition to hydraulic fracturing unfounded by concerns in sound science. Concerns, by the way, which were rejected by the EPA's own assessment. Now, most followers of this debate are well aware of the made-for-television scenes filmed not by scientists, but rather by agenda-driven movie producers, the most famous of which is, of course, The Faucet. Now, let's examine this most famous of anecdotes for a second. There exists no more potent symbol of the irrational and fact-free opposition to hydraulic fracturing which masquerades as science. Investigating the incident, the Colorado State Government's Oil and Gas Conservation Commission found in their incident disposition, and I quote, dissolved methane in well water appears to be biogenic in origin. Tests were positive for iron-related bacteria and sulfate-reducing bacteria. There are no indications of oil and gas-related impacts to water well. So, folks, when one thing appears to be the case, look a little bit closer, examine the evidence. Harking back to the $4+ million judgment in Dimock, Pennsylvania, let me read you what was said in the opening statement by Leslie Lewis, plaintiff, or attorney for the plaintiffs in that case, and I quote, this is not a case about toxic materials ending up in the water. We do not have proof of that. We do not have proof of that. This is not about fracking fluid appearing in the water, hydraulic fracturing materials. We don't have proof of that. That was said in the opening statement to the court by the plaintiff's attorney in the Dimock water case against Cabot. So, with this absence of evidence, let me implore the board to please uphold the draft assessment based on the sound science. As scientists are fond of saying, the plural of anecdote is not data. So, at the end of the day, the reasons underlying our commitment to environmental protection are the same as why we extract and consume energy in the first place. Done right, both enhance the quality of life for Americans and both further our human experience. There's no either or decision here. The science says we can do both. So, with this in mind, I would hope the board upholds the value of sound science by reaffirming its conclusion that hydraulic fracturing poses no systemic risk to groundwater per the EPA's own investigation and findings. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Reisinger. Next, I'd like to hear from Lynn Thorpe, representing Clean Water Action. And I believe that there was a handout distributed. It's It says Clean Water Action, Clean Water Fund, and it is also posted on the website for SAB. Okay, please go ahead, Ms. Thorpe.
Thank you. My name is Lynn Thorpe. I'm National Campaigns Director for Clean Water Action. We're a nationwide environmental organization, been working on a wide range of issues since 1972. Among our areas of expertise and focus are drinking water. We work across the range of Safe Drinking Water Act implementation activities, drinking water protection, especially where other authorities can be used to prevent contamination, and technical and emerging contaminant issues. I myself have served 2 terms on EPA's National Drinking Water Advisory Council and on a number of council work groups and federal advisory committees around Safe Drinking Water Act implementation issues. Thanks for the opportunity to address the board today. EPA's study design was appropriate given constrained resources, and the results identified dozens of vulnerabilities throughout the hydraulic fracturing life cycle. We commend the EPA for developing an extensive assessment that will inform our understanding of the impacts of hydraulic fracturing activity and support drinking water protection. In order for the assessment's findings not to be misunderstood or intentionally misconstrued, the high-level conclusions must be supported by the underlying information and findings. EPA should follow the recommendations of the majority of the SAB study panel and revise the major findings and conclusions section of the executive summary to clarify that EPA cannot say with certainty how widespread or systemic the impacts of hydraulic fracturing are due to the lack of available data and because EPA did not perform a statistical analysis of the number of cases of drinking water impacted versus the number of fracking activities. The study panel commented that the following statement in the executive summary: we did not find evidence that hydraulic fracturing mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources is ambiguous and inconsistent with the observations, data, and levels of uncertainty presented and discussed in the body of the draft assessment. EPA should prioritize this suggested revision in the finalization process. Impacts on drinking water do not have to be widespread to be significant. Discounting impacts as geographically confined undermines how severe the impacts can be and undervalues future vulnerabilities. The study panel also recommended that EPA include the analysis and status of 3 investigations in the final assessment: Pavilion, Wyoming, Dimmock, Pennsylvania, and Parker County, Texas. The Science Advisory Board should urge EPA to incorporate the study panel's recommendations and to commit to a timeline for finalization of the assessment. Absent a final assessment and action to address vulnerabilities identified, public health is jeopardized and drinking water sources remain vulnerable. The study panel undertook a transparent review process over a series of months, resulting in consensus recommendations developed by 31 scientists and engineers. These recommendations are reasonable and relatively minor compared to the breadth of EPA's assessment. Rejection of the panel's recommendations could be seen as an attempt to obfuscate the impacts of hydraulic fracturing and limit the public's understanding of potential threats to drinking water. The SAB should encourage EPA to ensure that the impressive body of work represented in the final assessment leads to stronger drinking water protection. EPA should publish a roadmap for addressing the vulnerabilities outlined in the assessment. This roadmap should include identification of actions that can be taken using existing authorities and within current programs, recommendations for addressing vulnerabilities that cannot be addressed by current programs, identification of further research needs, and an explanation of actions to reduce uncertainties in future research work. We ask the SAB to urge EPA to acknowledge the many uncertainties implicit in any discussion of impacts to drinking water. This includes lack of access to information and analysis sealed in non-disclosure agreements in legal proceedings over water contamination. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Thorpe.
Yeah, many thanks to you, Thomas and Tom and Peter, for the opportunity to respond to the EPA draft assessment report and for the insightful comments and criticisms from the Science Advisory Board regarding what has been arguably criticized as misleading information regarding the benign nature of unconventional shale gas and oil development and the impacts that has on groundwater. My name is Yuri Gorby. For 15 years, I worked for the U.S. Department of Energy at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation as a staff scientist, where we studied the fate and transport of heavy metals, radionuclides, and organic contaminants in groundwater. I was surrounded by a part of a team of hundreds of scientists that cooperated on these subsurface science issues. And that was from like 1991 until about 2006. Around 2005 and 2006, we noticed a marked decrease in the funding for environmental science regarding to fate and transport of subsurface contaminants. It actually coincided then with the passage of the 2005 Energy Policy Act and the development of an industry, a new technology, high-volume slickwater hydraulic fracturing, which is fundamentally different than conventional fracking or fracking of vertical wells. This is an advanced technology, one of the reasons why it was excluded from New York State, where I am now a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. By the way, the comments I provide today are my own and not representative of RPI or any of its administration, staff, or students. After the 15 years with the DOE Science Corps targeting the fate and contaminants of these radionuclides, we did notice a decrease in funding for that research. It coincided with the appointment of Dr. Ray Orbach, who assumed the position of the first Undersecretary of Science for the U.S. Department of Energy. This position was actually created by the 2005 Energy Policy Act. It is interesting to note that Dr. Orbach also became director of the Energy Institute of UT Austin and was forced to resign once it was learned that his deputy director, Charles Grove, received $1.2 million from the shale gas industry during the operation of that Energy Institute. It is also interesting that 4 other people that assumed that same position also received their PhDs in physics from MIT, including Dr. Ernie Moniz, who is currently the Secretary of US DOE, and who's now been given sole authority to transform import terminals along our coast to export terminals so that we can ship this national resource to foreign markets for sale. I'm not really here to I'm not here to talk about the political architecture, including the 2005 Energy Policy Act and the infamous Halliburton loophole that provides the exclusive exemptions from high-volume hydraulic fracturing and all related industrial activities, from the 11 laws designed to protect environmental and human health. Nor am I here to recite any of the hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific publications that document the environmental and human health impacts from these same industrial activities. Those can be located on a number of websites. I would point you to the Concerned Health Professionals of New York, Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy, and Physicians for Social Responsibility, to name a few. I am also certainly not here to add voice to Ray or to Craig. I mean, those guys, they don't need a choir of any type. Their voices are quite loud enough. But I am here to provide support for those dozens of families that I know personally in my home state of West Virginia and throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio that are suffering currently from serious health effects by living near these facilities, either from contamination from water, contamination from air emissions, or contamination from the waste streams that it generated. These things cannot be taken out of context. I know that it is the task of this advisory board and the EPA to focus on groundwater contamination, but this is like, you cannot separate a systems engineering concept. You have to look at cradle to grave of all of this, all of the impacts to environment and human health. I am, those people that I just mentioned, these are some of those people that have been silenced, either by lease agreements, by gag orders, by fear of having even their own family members turn against them, and have been victimized by those 11 approaches that Melissa Troutman and Public Care were describing, where state officials and state agencies are actually not, well, basically suppressing those voices. I'm here to give additional support to the silent voices of those more than 16,000 entries in the list of the harmed that documents American citizens impacted by shale gas and oil development.
Dr. Gorby, if you
Yes.
could wrap up.
Yes. One to just, I will end by this. This was fluid that we recovered from a hot water tank of a 92-year-old woman that lives in Ray, Pennsylvania. That whole entire area was impacted by shale gas development. I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to have my driller friend over there comment, or any of the industry people comment on. This happened during the drilling phase in Ray, Pennsylvania from some wells that were put near that system. And I can say when I touched this fluid as it came out of that hot water tank and it was contacting my skin, I immediately tasted metallic taste. I developed a headache that lasted for 2 days, and I was basically incapacitated for the rest of that trip down there. But you can see that this is not a normal fluid. This is, well, we don't exactly know what it is, but talking with my driller friends, there are soaps that are used during the drilling, and I know that we have to close up. Please check this out. I am definitely, it is the responsibility of this not only to protect and to bring sound science, but also to protect the environment and human and American citizens from harm from an industry that has really received grace from things like the 2005 Energy Policy Act. And I thank you for the time and opportunity to discuss this.
Okay, thank you very much. We appreciate your comments. Okay, so at this juncture then, I'd like to just ask members of the Science Advisory Board if they do have any follow-up questions, anything burning. I see no tents up, except one's going up, two are going up. Okay, well, so they went up and they went down. Gina?
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Zimmerman, because I believe he had some additional things that he wanted to contribute. I think they may have been around the abandoned well issue, and so I just wanted to give him an opportunity to say those things.
Thank you. I think the figure provided to us a little earlier by Mr. Carlson was that there are 500,000 abandoned wells in Pennsylvania as an estimate. That's a wild estimate, but it's an awful lot of wells. When you look at the situation, I think he referred to the depth that those wells were drilled as being relatively shallow. It's our understanding that the industry started in Pennsylvania by drilling in deeper and deeper wells with a deeper and deeper formation. And actually did a lot of drilling in what's called the Oriskany sandstone, which is below the Marcellus shale. So if you have abandoned wells completed in the Oriskany sandstone, and these wells would probably not be the case simply because of the age of the well, they simply would be open bore holes. That would mean that you have a conduit from that depth all the way to the surface. In every one of those situations where you're dealing with a Oriskany well and a fracking well nearby. Now there was a considerable amount of discussion on one other point that I'd like to make, related to when stopping drilling immediately when you see a loss of pressure. Certainly that is the case, but that decision was definitely not made instantaneously. It's made by the company man who's running the site, and then we'll look at the data while they continue to drill. That's a typical rule. However, that's not the main point. Remember, this all takes place in stages. The drilling of the well is not done at the same time that the fracking of the well is done. The drilling and completion of the well takes place, and then they come back and frack in sections. And when they frack, they're fracking with pressures in the 8,000 to 15,000 pounds per square inch range. And so when they frack, there's a plug, or a blast of energy, of pressure that goes out from that well site. If there's a conduit for that to reach an abandoned well that does come to the surface, then there's going to be a lot of pressure to drive material up that well. So look at the time relationship of when they don't know about the failure of that particular well. When they drill it, it looks all right. Then when they frack it, that's when they see the pulse, and that's when the problem comes up. Pennsylvania has been working on regulations for years to try new regulations to try to deal with this issue. And in their unconventional oil and gas draft regulations that are currently finishing up the process, called Chapter 78A. They will address this issue by requiring drillers to survey the entire area around their well site to find and plug and properly deal with abandoned wells. So the regulations may be getting better in at least one state, but they're not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. And
You started off by talking about your work had been, at the Hanford site, had been related to the fate and transport of radionuclides and groundwater. And you made some reference to changes in funding or interest in transport and fate of radionuclides. It wasn't clear to me the connection there, and I'm not so much interested in the in the changes in funding in different research directions, but the connection between research on fate and transport of radionuclides and fracking. I was wondering if you could clarify that connection.
Surely. Actually, my credentials were based largely on my discovery that there are microorganisms, bacteria, that can use uranium as an electron acceptor. They actually breathe uranium, change the chemistry of uranium, and these organisms are thought to have been involved in the deposition of uranium in shale gas deposits, for instance. So the relationship with subsurface fate and transport of contaminants of various types is a direct relationship in terms of the approaches in science that one would apply to understanding, for instance, the complexity of fate and transport of contaminants or hazardous chemicals in areas that have been hydraulic fracture. My surprise was about 3 or 4 years ago, during one of our principal investigator meetings at the U.S. Department of Energy, was that these 300 or 400 scientists that we worked together with were fully unaware of hydraulic fracture, high volume hydraulic fracture. In fact, I asked a question at the PI meeting of about 300 scientists, how many of you have heard of this? And 3 people raised their hands. I have to remember that at that time, I mean, this was probably the best group of scientists in the world to address fate transport issues. We had ongoing programs within the Department of Energy, hundreds of millions of dollars. The loss of that funding, not only the loss of the funding, but the loss of that scientific capability of our core scientific research components within the Department of Energy, without any knowledge of what was going on back east. We focused mostly out in Colorado and in Washington State, in those areas. That was really like something like surprising to me. And as I got further into like where, how is that funding, how is that basically moved around, it revealed to me how the inner workings of and why we had no awareness of what was actually happening back in the shale gas fields back east.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Worth? Wide range of public commenters, and again, I want to thank all of them for taking the time to prepare their remarks and think about this issue and to come before us and share their opinions, and those are very highly valuable